I remember standing in that kitchen like it was someone else's life I was watching through glass. The linoleum was cold beneath my bare feet, and I held that chipped blue mug between my palms, feeling the heat seep through the ceramic. Steam rose from the coffee I wouldn't drink, curling up toward the overhead light that buzzed with the persistence of something dying slowly. Rain drummed against the window above the sink, each drop catching the glow from the street lamp outside before sliding down the glass like tears I couldn't shed. Behind me, laughter erupted from the living room where my wife and son sat watching television together. Their voices felt distant, muffled, as if they existed in another world entirely. Evelyn's laugh was the same bright sound that had drawn me to her 15 years ago, but now it seemed to echo from across an ocean I hadn't realized I was drowning in. The photo lay there on the kitchen table, half hidden beneath a stack of bills I kept meaning to sort through. Property taxes, electric, the orthodontist wanting another payment for Marcus's braces. All the small anchors of a life lived responsibly, lived safely, lived without question. But that photograph pulled at something deep in my chest, the way certain songs can transport you instantly to places you thought you'd forgotten. Two boys, maybe 16, standing on a makeshift stage at summer camp. The memory flooded back with startling clarity. Camp Wildwood, 1987. The talent show on the last night before we all went home to our separate lives. There I was in the photo, holding that ridiculous paper guitar I'd crafted from cardboard and markers, my hair falling in my eyes the way it did back then. I was smiling, but it was the nervous smile of someone trying too hard to fit in, to be normal, to be what everyone expected. And beside me stood Theo. Even in that faded photograph, his presence seemed to shimmer with something electric. He wore black eyeliner that night, smudged around his green eyes like war paint. His grin was crooked, unashamed, beautiful in its defiance. While I clutched my fake guitar like a shield, he stood with his arms spread wide, embracing whatever judgment might come. I turned the photo over with trembling fingers and read the words I'd memorized years ago, written in Theo's careful handwriting. "You're the only one who clapped." Never forgot that. The weight of that summer night crashed over me again. How the other campers had snickered when Theo took the stage alone after our awkward duet. How he'd recited original poetry about loneliness and beauty and being different in a world that demanded conformity. How the silence had stretched impossibly long when he finished, broken only by my own applause echoing through that wooden pavilion like a declaration I hadn't known I was making. I set the mug down on the counter with shaking hands and listened to my family's comfortable contentment drifting from the next room. This house, this life, this careful construction of normalcy I'd built around myself suddenly felt like a costume I'd been wearing for so long I'd forgotten my own skin underneath. The television's volume increased, drowning out the rain, drowning out the thoughts I'd been pushing down for months, for years. But the photograph remained, a door to a version of myself I'd locked away the day I graduated college and decided to become the man everyone expected me to be. That night, I waited. I waited until Evelyn kissed my cheek and climbed the stairs to our bedroom. I waited until Marcus called out good night from his room down the hall. I waited until the house settled into that particular silence that comes when everyone else is safely asleep and dreaming their own dreams. Then I opened my phone and stared at the message I'd typed and deleted a dozen times over the past month. The cursor blinked at me like a heartbeat, steady and insistent. My thumb hovered over the send button as I thought about all the reasons this was foolish, dangerous, impossible. But the photograph lay there beside me, and I could almost hear Theo's voice from that distant summer, fearless and true and completely, utterly himself. I pressed send before I could change my mind again. The message was simple: I'm still in the same house. If you ever need a place to stay. I didn't expect a reply. How could I, after all these years of silence, of choosing safety over truth, of pretending that some doors, once closed, could never be opened again? But at dawn, as the first gray light crept through the kitchen window and my coffee had long since grown cold, my phone buzzed with a single message that would change everything. I'm coming. Tomorrow. The morning after I sent that message, I stood in front of my classroom like I had every weekday for the past 12 years, watching 17-year-olds pretend to care about the Great Gatsby while their minds wandered to weekend plans and social media notifications. I knew this dance well. I'd perfected the art of appearing engaged while my own thoughts drifted elsewhere, somewhere beyond these beige walls and fluorescent lights that hummed with the same dying persistence as everything else in my carefully constructed life. Our town sat nestled in the Connecticut River Valley, one of those New England places that looked perfect in autumn postcards but felt suffocating the other 11 months of the year. Tree-lined streets, white church steeples, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business and expected both to remain exactly the same forever. I'd moved here with Evelyn right after college, drawn by the promise of stability, good schools for the children we planned to have, a teaching position that would let me shape young minds while living quietly, respectably, normally. The house we bought sat on Maple Street, 3 bedrooms with blue shutters and a garden Evelyn tended with the same gentle persistence she brought to everything else. She was beautiful in that effortless way some women possess, her blonde hair always falling perfectly around her shoulders, her smile genuine and warm when it appeared, which was less often now, I'd noticed, though I wasn't sure exactly when that had changed. We moved through our days like dancers who'd forgotten the steps, but continued going through the motions. She'd leave notes on the refrigerator in her careful handwriting. Don't forget Marcus has practice at 4. Dinner with your parents Sunday. Pick up milk. Small reminders of a shared life that somehow felt increasingly separate. At night, we'd lie in our king-sized bed with its sage green comforter, each of us claiming our own territory. She'd read her book club selection while I graded papers, the space between us filled with a silence that had grown comfortable in its familiarity. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me with a question in her eyes, but neither of us seemed brave enough to ask it out loud. Marcus was 15 now, tall and lanky like I'd been at his age, but with his mother's easy confidence. He played varsity soccer, dated a sweet girl named Amy, made decent grades without much effort. He was everything a father should be proud of, and I was proud of him. But there was a distance there too, as if I were watching his life through that same glass that seemed to separate me from everything real and immediate. At school, I'd earned a reputation as the English teacher who actually cared, who stayed after hours to help struggling students, who ran the literary magazine and organized poetry readings that 12 people attended. My colleagues respected me. Principal Henderson often asked my opinion on curriculum changes. Parents requested me specifically for their children. I was exactly the kind of teacher this town valued, dedicated, dependable, invisible in all the ways that mattered. But walking through those hallways, past the art wing where student laughter echoed off the walls, I'd remember a different version of myself. A version that had once believed in the transformative power of words, who'd stayed up late writing plays and poems and stories that might change the world, or at least change one person who read them. I remembered Theo from those days, when we were both 18 and thought we could remake reality through sheer force of imagination. He'd been the art student everyone noticed, the one who dyed his hair different colors each month and wore jewelry that caught the light as he moved through the halls like he was dancing to music only he could hear. He wrote songs and painted murals and recited his own poetry at the coffee house downtown, unafraid of judgment, unashamed of his own intensity. I'd been drawn to him like iron to magnet, though I couldn't have named the attraction then. We'd collaborated on a play for the school's experimental theater program, something we called Fragments of Light, that was probably pretentious and certainly earnest. Theo brought music and movement to my words, made them sing in ways I hadn't known they could. But this town didn't know what to do with boys like Theo. The whispers followed him down hallways. The casual cruelty of teenagers who smelled difference and attacked it instinctively. I watched it happen and said nothing, did nothing, chose silence over solidarity because I was already learning to prioritize safety over truth. When he left for art school in California, I felt something close to relief mixed with a loss I couldn't articulate. I told myself it was better this way, cleaner, more practical. I could focus on my studies, my plans for a teaching career, my relationship with Evelyn, who was safe and kind and wanted the same quiet life I'd convinced myself I wanted to. Now, standing in my classroom 22 years later, I wondered what had happened to that boy who'd believed words could change everything. Where had I buried him? And why did I suddenly feel him clawing his way back to the surface? The bell rang, startling me from my reverie. Students gathered their belongings with the practiced efficiency of people eager to be elsewhere. I erased the whiteboard, packed my papers, prepared for another evening of grading and pretending that the routine of my days added up to something meaningful. But walking to my car in the faculty parking lot, I kept checking my phone, waiting for something, waiting for tomorrow to arrive and prove that some messages, once sent, couldn't be taken back. That night at dinner, Evelyn asked how my day had been. I gave her the same answer I always gave. Fine. Good kids this year. How was yours? She told me about her shift at the library, about Mrs. Peterson's book recommendations, about the new coffee shop opening downtown. Marcus pushed his food around his plate and asked if he could skip family movie night. He had plans with Amy. I said yes before Evelyn could object, and she gave me that look again, the one that asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. Later, after they'd both gone to bed, I sat in my study surrounded by the books that had once felt like doorways to infinite possibilities and now seemed like monuments to roads not taken. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow, everything might change. Tomorrow, Theo would come home. He arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the October light was beginning to slant golden through the maple trees that gave our street its name. I was grading essays at the kitchen table when I heard the car door slam, and something inside me went very still. Through the window, I watched him pull a single worn duffel bag from the back seat of a taxi, the same careful movements I remembered from 25 years ago, as if he were always conscious of taking up too much space in the world. Theo looked smaller than I remembered, though perhaps that was just the way memory tends to magnify the people who matter most to us. His hair was shorter now, a natural brown instead of the experimental colors of his youth, and he wore simple jeans and a gray sweater that had seen better days. But when he turned toward the house and our eyes met through the glass, I saw that his gaze still held that same intensity, that quality of seeing everything at once and finding it both beautiful and heartbreaking. I opened the door before he could knock. We stood there for a moment, two middle-aged men trying to reconcile the present with a past that felt both impossibly distant and immediately present. He was thinner than he should have been, his cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had been weathered by too much sun and not enough steady shelter. But his eyes, those green eyes that had always seemed to hold secrets, still flickered with something wild and wounded and utterly alive. He said he'd been traveling, drifting from place to place for the past few years. There had been jobs that didn't last, relationships that burned too bright and flamed out, apartments he couldn't afford when the work disappeared. He'd been staying with a friend in Portland, but that had fallen through last month. He said this all quietly, matter-of-factly, as if homelessness were just another weather pattern he'd learned to navigate. I wanted to ask why he'd been running, what he'd been running from, but some questions require years of trust to answer safely. Instead, I helped him carry his bag upstairs to the attic room we'd converted to a guest space, but rarely used. It was small but bright, with slanted ceilings and a window that looked out over the backyard where Evelyn's vegetable garden was surrendering to autumn. When Evelyn came home from the library that evening, I introduced them carefully, watching her face for signs of the suspicion I feared but didn't see. She was gracious in that way she'd mastered over the years, offering tea and asking polite questions about his journey. When I explained that Theo was an old friend who needed a place to stay temporarily, she nodded and asked how long he might be with us. Just for a while, I said, and she repeated the words back to me later that night in our bedroom, making them sound like both a question and a warning. Just for a while, right? But from the first morning, I knew there would be nothing temporary about the way Theo's presence began to change the air in our house. I woke to the sound of music drifting down from the attic, something classical and complex that Evelyn never played and I didn't recognize. When I went to the kitchen for coffee, I found him there ahead of me, making some kind of elaborate breakfast involving ingredients I didn't know we had. He cooked the way he did everything else, with complete attention and no self-consciousness about taking up space. He'd found spices I'd forgotten we owned, herbs from Evelyn's garden that she'd grown but never used, and somehow transformed our ordinary kitchen into a place where interesting things happened. The smell of cardamom and cinnamon filled the air, mixing with coffee and something else I couldn't identify, but that made me want to linger longer than I should have. Over the next few days, evidence of his presence began to appear throughout the house like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Art supplies on the dining room table, books I'd never seen before left open on the couch, small sketches tucked between the pages of magazines. Not intrusive, exactly, but present in a way that made me newly aware of how sterile our home had become, how carefully we'd eliminated anything that might surprise us. Marcus was curious about our house guest, but kept his distance, the way teenagers do when adults display behavior they can't quite categorize. Evelyn remained polite but watchful, and I caught her studying both of us when she thought we weren't looking, as if trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't realized existed until now. One evening, about a week after his arrival, she asked me directly. We were cleaning up after dinner while Theo helped Marcus with algebra at the kitchen table, their heads bent together over equations I'd given up trying to understand years ago. "Did you two used to be close?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. I dried the same plate 3 times while I considered how to answer. "We did a play together once," I finally said. "In high school." She nodded as if this explained everything, or perhaps nothing, but she didn't ask anything else. Later, lying in bed with our familiar distance between us, I wondered what she heard in my voice when I spoke about him, what she saw in my face that I couldn't see myself. The real moment came near the end of his second week with us. I'd been staying up later than usual, finding excuses to be awake when the house grew quiet, and Theo would sometimes venture downstairs for tea or to sit on the back porch with one of his ever-present sketchbooks. We'd fallen into a pattern of these late-night encounters, talking quietly about books and music, and the strange ways life unfolds differently than we expect. That particular night, I found him in the living room, sitting in darkness except for the light from the street lamp outside. He was just sitting there, staring at nothing, and something in his stillness made me stop in the doorway instead of joining him. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I almost missed it. "You're the only one who doesn't treat me like a joke," he said. The words hit me like a physical blow, carrying with them the weight of all the years I'd wondered what happened to him. All the nights I'd lain awake remembering that boy with the crooked grin and the fearless heart who'd been brave enough to be himself when I couldn't manage the same courage. I didn't know how to respond, so I sat down beside him in the darkness and let the silence stretch between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility, dangerous and terrifying, and completely alive. Outside, the October wind rustled through the maple trees, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, carrying its lonely song toward destinations I'd never been brave enough to imagine. The attic became our sanctuary without either of us acknowledging it as such. It started innocently enough, me helping Theo organize the sketches that seemed to multiply, like living things across every surface of the small room. Drawings of hands and faces, architectural studies of buildings I didn't recognize, landscapes that felt more like emotional states than actual places. His work had a quality I'd never seen before, a way of capturing not just what things looked like, but how they felt, the weight of loneliness in an empty cafe, the particular sadness of autumn light falling through unwashed windows. I began finding excuses to spend my evenings up there, grading papers while he worked, reading aloud from books I'd forgotten I loved, sharing stories about students who reminded me why I'd become a teacher in the first place. The slanted ceiling created an intimacy that the rest of the house lacked, a sense of being tucked away from the world and its expectations. For the first time in years, I heard myself laugh the way I used to, before responsibility and routine had trained me to measure every response for appropriateness. Theo had a way of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things. Not the polite inquiries that filled most of my conversations, but real questions that required real answers. He wanted to know why I'd stopped writing, what had happened to the boy who'd believed poetry could change the world, whether I ever missed the person I'd been before I learned to be careful. I found myself staying later each night, reluctant to return to the bedroom where Evelyn slept with her back turned toward my side of the bed. The attic felt like a place outside of time, where I could remember what it felt like to be curious about my own thoughts, to speak them aloud without editing them first for safety. The night the power went out, I was reading Theo something from an old collection of Neruda's poems when everything went dark. October storms were common in our part of Connecticut, and I knew where Evelyn kept the emergency candles, but neither of us moved to find them immediately. We sat in the sudden darkness, listening to the wind shake the windows and the rain drum against the roof with increasing intensity. When I finally went downstairs for candles, I could hear Evelyn moving around in our bedroom, probably looking for the flashlight we kept in the nightstand. Marcus called out from his room asking if the Wi-Fi would come back soon. The sounds of my family managing this minor crisis felt distant, muffled, as if they were happening in another house entirely. Back in the attic, candlelight transformed the space into something from a different century. The flames cast shifting shadows on the slanted walls, and Theo's face looked younger in the warm glow, more like the boy I remembered from that summer camp talent show. We sat closer now, sharing the small circle of light, and when he asked his question, his voice was soft enough that I had to lean in to hear him clearly. "Do you ever think about who you were supposed to be?" I stared at the shadows dancing on the wall, remembering all the versions of myself I'd imagined and discarded over the years. The playwright who would write the great American drama. The teacher who would inspire a generation of young writers. The husband who would be fully present in his marriage. The father who would know how to talk to his son about the things that mattered. All the time, I admitted. We talked until the candles burned low about the gap between the lives we'd planned and the ones we'd actually lived. Theo told me about the art school in California, how he'd thrived there for a while before something inside him broke and he'd started running from anything that felt too much like home. He described years of temporary jobs and temporary relationships, of never letting himself settle anywhere long enough to be truly known or truly hurt. I told him about the slow erosion of my own dreams, how I'd convinced myself that stability was more valuable than passion, that a quiet life was the same thing as a meaningful one. How I'd spent so many years trying to be the man everyone expected me to be that I'd forgotten who I actually was underneath all those expectations. The power came back just after midnight, sudden and jarring after hours of soft candlelight. We blew out the flames and sat in the harsh overhead light, blinking at each other like people waking from the same dream. But something had shifted between us in those dark hours. Some wall had come down that I wasn't sure I wanted to rebuild. Downstairs, I could feel the change in my family's rhythm. Evelyn had started going to bed earlier, claiming headaches that might or might not have been real. She'd stopped leaving notes on the refrigerator, stopped asking about my day in ways that suggested she actually wanted to know the answer. At dinner, conversation became increasingly strained, punctuated by silences that felt loaded with things none of us knew how to say. Marcus began skipping school, something I only discovered when the vice principal called my classroom during third period. When I confronted him about it that evening, he shrugged and said he didn't see why it mattered since nobody at home seemed to care about anything anymore anyway. The accusation stung because it felt too close to the truth. The house became divided into territories we navigated carefully. Evelyn claimed the downstairs, spending her evenings reading in the living room or organizing things that didn't need organizing. Marcus retreated to his bedroom, door closed, music loud enough to discourage interruption, and I found myself drawn upward, to the attic where Theo worked by lamplight, and asked the kinds of questions that made me remember I had thoughts worth expressing. The sketch appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when I came home from school to find Theo gone on one of his long walks through town. It was lying on his desk, partially hidden beneath other drawings, but something about the composition caught my eye. The subject was clearly me, though rendered with a tenderness that made me catch my breath. I was sleeping in the armchair by the window, my hand curled near my mouth in a gesture I recognized from childhood photographs, my face peaceful in a way I rarely felt when awake. The drawing captured something I hadn't realized anyone was seeing, a vulnerability I thought I kept carefully hidden. Every line seemed to hold affection, a kind of gentle attention that made my chest tight with recognition and longing. I stood there staring at myself through Theo's eyes, understanding for the first time that someone had been watching me with love, had been seeing past the careful composure I maintained to something more essential underneath. I didn't ask when he'd drawn it or why he'd kept it. Some questions would require courage I wasn't sure I possessed yet. But I carried the image with me for days afterward, the knowledge that I existed in someone else's imagination, not as the responsible teacher or distant husband or preoccupied father, but as someone worthy of that kind of careful observation, that kind of tender regard. The October nights were growing colder, and sometimes I'd find excuses to bring extra blankets up to the attic, to check that Theo was warm enough in that small room under the eaves. He'd smile when I appeared with another quilt or cup of tea, as if he understood exactly what I was doing and why, but he never commented on my sudden concern for his comfort. We were dancing around something neither of us was ready to name, but I could feel it growing stronger with each passing day, each evening spent in that candlelit sanctuary we'd created above the careful life I'd built below. It began with small things, moments so brief I could have convinced myself I imagined them if I'd wanted to maintain that particular self-deception. A hand brushing against mine when we both reached for the same book, eyes meeting and holding for just a beat longer than politeness required. The way he'd look at me sometimes when I was reading aloud, as if my voice carried something more than just the words on the page. I found myself noticing things about him I shouldn't have been noticing. The way his hair fell across his forehead when he bent over his sketches, the precise movements of his hands when he cooked, how he looked when he slept on the living room couch during his afternoon naps, one arm thrown over his eyes, his breathing deep, and even in a way that suggested dreams more peaceful than his waking hours usually allowed. I began timing my movements around the house to these small encounters, coming downstairs for coffee when I knew he'd be in the kitchen, lingering in the living room when he was there reading. Nothing I could name as intentional, nothing that crossed any lines I'd drawn for myself over the years. But the awareness was there, humming between us like an electrical current I couldn't quite ignore. Then he volunteered to help with the spring play. I'd announced the auditions in October, earlier than usual because the drama program needed time to prepare for the state competition. We were doing our town, which felt appropriate for our particular corner of New England, and I needed someone to help with set design and lighting. When Theo offered his services, I should have said no. I should have recognized the danger in spending even more time together, in adding another layer to our growing intimacy. Instead, I said yes before I could think of all the reasons it was a terrible idea. The auditorium became another sanctuary, this one larger and more public, but somehow just as private in the early evenings when we worked alone. Theo approached theater the way he approached everything else, with complete attention and an instinct for beauty that transformed our modest stage into something magical. He designed lighting that turned our simple set into a living painting, taught the students how to move through space as if they belonged there, brought a sense of wonder to the production that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with theater in the first place. The evening it happened was a Tuesday in late November. Rehearsal had ended early when our leading man came down with the flu, and most of the cast had already headed home to homework and part-time jobs. I was in my office adjacent to the auditorium, finalizing the program notes, when I heard a voice from the stage. It was Theo, but speaking words I hadn't heard in over 20 years. A monologue I'd written in high school, something pretentious and earnest about isolation and the masks we wear to hide our true selves from the world. I'd never shared it with anyone, had buried it in a notebook I thought I'd thrown away years ago. But there he was, alone on our small stage under the work lights, reciting my words as if they were Shakespeare. His voice gave them a weight and beauty I'd never heard before, found in my clumsy teenage poetry something worth preserving, worth remembering, worth speaking aloud in an empty theater 25 years later. I stood in the doorway watching him, my heart doing something irregular and painful in my chest. He knew the entire piece. Every word, every pause, every emphasis exactly as I'd written it. Which meant he'd kept it all these years, had carried something I'd created through whatever wandering paths his life had taken, had valued it enough to memorize it completely. When he finished, the silence stretched between us like a bridge I finally understood I was meant to cross. He saw me standing there and didn't look embarrassed or caught, just smiled that crooked smile I remembered from our shared youth. I stepped onto the stage and asked him where he'd found it. He said he'd saved everything from those days, the few things that had made him feel less alone in the world. My words, he said, had been some of those things. Then he said something that broke whatever careful distance I'd been maintaining between us. I wasn't supposed to live like this. I thought if I kept moving, I wouldn't have to feel how lonely I really am. The admission hung in the air between us, and I understood that we'd moved beyond the careful territory of old friendship into something more dangerous and necessary. He was looking at me with such naked vulnerability that I felt something inside me crack open, some wall I'd built to protect myself from exactly this moment. I kissed him then, gently, tentatively, like touching a wound I was afraid might bleed. His lips were soft and warm and tasted like the coffee we'd shared earlier, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing else existed except the two of us on that small stage under the work lights. When we pulled apart, the world felt different, rearranged into new patterns I couldn't quite understand yet. We stood there breathing in the altered air, and I knew that whatever happened next, I could never unknow the way it felt to finally be honest about what I'd been wanting. He said my name like a question, and I answered by taking his hand, by letting him see in my face that this wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness, but something I'd been moving toward without knowing it for longer than I wanted to admit. We left the school together, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't go home. Instead, I followed him to a small motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that didn't ask questions and took cash without requiring much in the way of identification. We sat on the edge of the bed talking until dawn, holding hands like teenagers, afraid to move too fast, but unable to pretend anymore that we were just old friends catching up on lost time. Nothing happened that night beyond conversation and the revolutionary act of being completely honest with another human being about who I was underneath all the roles I'd learned to play. But lying there in the gray morning light, listening to Theo breathe beside me, I understood that I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. That the careful life I'd built was already crumbling, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it from falling apart. I came home at dawn to find Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She was still wearing her nightgown, her blonde hair uncombed, and she looked up at me with eyes that held no surprise, only a kind of weary recognition. She didn't ask where I'd been. We both understood that the time for those kinds of questions had passed. I sat down across from her at the table where we'd shared 15 years of breakfast conversations, where we'd helped Marcus with homework and paid bills and planned family vacations to places we thought we should want to visit. The morning light streaming through the window felt harsh after the gentle darkness of the motel room, and I had to resist the urge to shield my eyes from it. She spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. "I always knew," she said. "I just thought you'd never admit it." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind, because they suggested she'd been carrying this knowledge alone for longer than I'd been carrying it myself. I looked at this woman I'd promised to love and honor, who had given me a son and a home and 15 years of patient companionship, and felt the full weight of what I was about to destroy. I told her everything then. About Theo, about the feelings I'd been running from since high school, about the kiss on the stage and the night we'd spent talking until sunrise. I told her about the sketch he'd drawn of me sleeping, about the way he'd remembered my poem from 25 years ago, about how being with him made me feel like a person I'd forgotten I could be. She listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around that cold coffee cup like it was an anchor keeping her steady. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, and I could hear the house waking up around us. Marcus's alarm going off upstairs, the familiar sounds of a Thursday morning proceeding as if the world hadn't just tilted off its axis. Finally, she looked at me with something that might have been relief mixed with grief. "I can't do this anymore, Julian. I can't pretend we're happy when we're just going through the motions." She asked me to leave. Not angrily, not with tears or accusations, but with the calm finality of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation longer than either of us had realized. She said she needed time to figure out what came next, what to tell Marcus, how to untangle a life we'd built together when half of it had been built on a foundation I'd never been fully committed to. I packed a bag while she called in sick to work, while Marcus got ready for school in blissful ignorance of the fact that his family was dissolving around him. I took only what I needed immediately, leaving behind the accumulated weight of 15 years of careful domestic life. Books I'd collected, photographs of family vacations, the coffee mug Evelyn had given me on our 5th anniversary with "World's Best Dad" printed in fading letters. Marcus was eating cereal at the kitchen counter when I came downstairs with my suitcase. He looked at the bag, then at my face, and something in his expression shifted from confusion to understanding to anger so quickly I almost missed the transition. "Where are you going?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be one he wanted to hear. I tried to explain, to find words that would make sense of something I barely understood myself, but everything I said sounded like excuse and betrayal. He listened with the particular stillness that teenagers master when adults are disappointing them, and when I finished, he turned back to his cereal without saying anything at all. When I tried to hug him goodbye, he pulled away. When I told him I loved him, he looked at me with eyes that were learning to see his father as a stranger. The silence that followed me out of the house was louder than any words he might have spoken. Theo was waiting in the attic when I returned later that morning to tell him what had happened. He was packing his worn duffel bag with the same careful movements I'd watched him use to unpack it weeks ago, and his face was set in lines of guilt and determination that I recognized from our shared youth. "I didn't come here to blow up your life," he said without looking at me. I told him that wasn't what had happened, that he hadn't destroyed anything that wasn't already broken. But he shook his head and continued folding his few shirts with precise attention. He said he should have known better than to think he could stay anywhere without causing damage, that he'd been selfish to imagine he could have this without consequences. I touched his face then, gently, the way I'd wanted to do for weeks without admitting it to myself. "You didn't blow up my life," I said. "You reminded me I have one." But he was already retreating into that careful distance I remembered from high school, already protecting himself from the pain of hoping for something he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. He said he'd find somewhere else to go, that he always did, that he was good at starting over in places where nobody knew him. I could have let him leave. It would have been easier, cleaner, less complicated for everyone involved. I could have stayed in my marriage and continued teaching and pretended that these weeks had been an aberration, a momentary lapse that didn't have to define the rest of my life. Instead, I asked him to wait for me. I found a small apartment by the sea, 40 minutes from town in a village that existed primarily for summer tourists and locals who preferred their privacy. It was tiny, just a bedroom and kitchen and living room that faced the water through windows that had been painted shut by decades of salt air. The rent was more than I could afford on a teacher's salary, but it came furnished and available immediately, and most importantly, it was mine in a way nothing had been mine for years. The first night alone there, I sat on the narrow bed listening to the waves crash against the rocks below and wondering what I'd done. I'd given up a comfortable home, a stable marriage, daily access to my son, and a reputation I'd spent decades building, all for the possibility of something I couldn't name and wasn't sure I understood. But when I opened my laptop and began to write for the first time in over 20 years, the words came easily, naturally, as if they'd been waiting all this time for me to finally have something honest to say. I wrote about autumn mornings and attic sanctuaries and the particular loneliness of living a life that looks perfect from the outside, but feels empty in all the places that should matter most. I wrote until dawn, and when I finally fell asleep to the sound of the ocean outside my window, I dreamed of stages and spotlights and the courage it takes to speak your truth even when you're not sure anyone is listening. Spring came slowly to the coast that year, arriving in small increments that I measured by the changing light outside my windows. The harsh winter winds that had rattled the glass for months began to soften, carrying with them the scent of salt and something green and growing. I'd been living by the sea for 6 months now, long enough to learn the rhythms of the tides, to recognize the different calls of the gulls, to understand that solitude and loneliness were not the same thing. The apartment had become more than just a place to sleep. I'd arranged the furniture to face the water, hung my few possessions on walls that had probably sheltered dozens of other temporary residents over the years. My laptop lived on a small table by the window where I wrote most mornings, watching the sun rise over water that stretched toward horizons I was still learning to imagine. The writing had become a daily practice, sometimes just a few paragraphs, sometimes pages that poured out of me like something that had been dammed up for decades. Stories about small-town teachers and their secret longings, about marriages that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow within, about the courage it takes to choose truth over comfort. I wasn't sure if any of it was good, but it felt necessary in a way nothing had felt necessary for years. Marcus still wouldn't speak to me directly, but Evelyn had started sending brief updates by email. He was doing better in school, had made varsity soccer as a sophomore, was dating a different girl now. She wrote these updates in careful, neutral language that told me nothing about how he felt about his father's disappearance from his daily life, but everything about how much it had cost him. I carried the letter in my coat pocket for weeks before I finally wrote it, and then carried it for weeks more without sending it. It was written on real paper, in my own handwriting, the way important things should be written. I told him I was sorry for the confusion and pain I'd caused, that I understood if he needed time to forgive me, that I would wait as long as it took for him to be ready to know his father as I actually was rather than as I pretended to be. But I hadn't sent it yet. Some communications require exactly the right moment, and I wasn't sure that moment had arrived. The call from Theo came on a Thursday morning in late April. He'd been working at a small gallery in Portland, but the job had ended and he was thinking about moving on again. His voice sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with the particular exhaustion that comes from never allowing yourself to stay anywhere long enough to call it home. I didn't ask him to come back. I'd learned over the winter that some invitations have to be extended carefully, that pushing too hard can send certain people running in the opposite direction. Instead, I told him about the writing, about the way the ocean looked different every morning depending on the weather and the light. I told him about the small town where I lived now, how it emptied out in winter and came alive again in spring, how there were art galleries and coffee shops that stayed open year-round for the handful of locals who'd chosen to make this place their permanent home. When I hung up, I wasn't sure what he'd decide. But 3 days later, I saw him from my window, sitting on the bench that faced the water about a quarter-mile down the beach. He had his sketch pad open and was drawing something with the same careful attention I remembered, his dark hair moving in the salt breeze. I walked slowly along the shoreline, taking my time, giving him space to see me coming and decide whether he wanted company. The sand was cool beneath my feet, still holding winter in its depths despite the warming air. Sandpipers ran back and forth at the water's edge, chasing retreating waves with the particular urgency of small creatures who understand that opportunity is always fleeting. He looked up when I was still 20 feet away and smiled that crooked smile that had haunted my dreams for months. He looked better than he had at Christmas, less fragile, as if the winter had given him time to remember who he was when he wasn't running from something. I sat down beside him on the weathered bench without asking permission. We didn't speak immediately, just sat there watching the waves roll in and retreat, with the patience of water that has learned to reshape the world slowly, one grain of sand at a time. His sketchpad was open to a drawing of the lighthouse that stood at the far end of the beach, but he'd rendered it not as the pristine tourist attraction it became in summer, but as it looked now, weathered and salt-stained and beautiful in its imperfection. The way he'd captured the light falling across the rocks made me understand that he saw this place the way I'd learned to see it, as somewhere that didn't demand anything of you except honesty. The letter to Marcus crinkled in my coat pocket when I shifted on the bench, and I thought about all the words I'd written to people I loved, all the explanations and apologies and promises I wasn't sure I could keep. But sitting there beside Theo in the spring afternoon, I understood that some things didn't require words, that presence could be its own kind of communication. I placed my hand on the bench between us, palm up, an offering he could accept or ignore as he chose. For a moment that stretched like held breath, nothing happened. Then his fingers found mine, warm and calloused from months of work I knew nothing about, and covered my hand with the same gentle attention he brought to everything else. We sat like that as the afternoon light began to slant golden across the water, two middle-aged men who'd taken most of their lives to learn that love isn't always convenient or comfortable or easy to explain to other people. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of spring and possibility and the particular freedom that comes from finally telling the truth about who you are and what you need. This wasn't a beginning, exactly, though it felt like one. It wasn't an ending either, though I knew it marked the conclusion of one version of my life and the tentative start of another. It was simply a moment, real and impossible to ignore, when two people who'd spent years pretending to be someone else finally allowed themselves to be seen.